Montana Territory, late summer of 1883, the air smelled of pine smoke and dust when the girl said, "I do not dance," and the cowboy replied, "Then let me teach you in my arms." The sun had just begun to fall behind the Bitterroot Range when Quinton McAllister rode into the valley with his horse trailing dust and his hat pulled low over his brow. He had not meant to stop in Alder Bend. It was only supposed to be a pass-through on his way to Bozeman. But he caught sight of the girl standing outside a small whitewashed schoolhouse, sleeves rolled up, chalk dust on her skirt, and something settled in him that had been restless for years. Her name was Adeline Avery, 22, a schoolteacher, independent as a mule and just as stubborn. She had been in Alder Bend for 5 months now, long enough for the townsfolk to stop asking if she had family coming. The answer was always no. She had come alone, riding a freight wagon from Missouri with a suitcase, a few books, and a past she did not talk about. Quinton first saw her that evening during the town's harvest gathering. Fiddles played under the strings of lanterns hung between apple trees. People danced in the orchard clearing, boots scuffing dirt and skirts spinning. But Adeline stayed back, arms folded, watching with a quiet sort of ache in her eyes. Quinton crossed the field, drawn by something he could not name. "You do not dance?" he asked, his voice low and easy. Adeline glanced up, not startled, just wary. "No," he smiled gently, offering nothing but time. "Then let me teach you in my arms." She stared at him for a long second, then shook her head with a soft breath. "I said I do not dance." Quinton did not push. He just nodded, tipped his hat, and sat on the wooden fence nearby, watching the dancers with her. He said nothing more that night, but she noticed him watching the children, the way his eyes went soft around the edges when a small boy tugged at his father's coat. She caught him rubbing his thumb over a gold ring he wore on a chain around his neck. Adeline left early, walking back to her rented cabin behind the schoolhouse. She did not expect to see him again. But the next morning he was there fixing the broken fence around the schoolyard before the children arrived. She stepped out onto the porch in her apron, arms crossed, the morning chill still in her breath. "Why are you doing that?" He leaned on the post, hammer in hand. "Because someone should. You do not even live here." "I might," he said, and met her gaze. She blinked. "What is your name?" "Quinton McAllister." He did not ask hers. He already knew. By the third day he had fixed the fence, painted the door, and brought fresh apples from the orchard for her students. Adeline tried to keep her walls up, but the children adored him, especially little Leela, the smallest in the class. She had not spoken much since her parents abandoned her at the church steps 2 months ago. But she followed Quinton around like a shadow, holding his hand when he read books aloud under the cottonwoods at recess. "You are good with her," Adeline said one day as they watched Leela fall asleep curled up beside the schoolhouse wall. Quinton's face turned serious. "I had a daughter, 2 actually." Adeline looked at him then, really looked. "Had they died? Fever took them." 3 years back." She did not know what to say. Her throat closed tight. He glanced at her, voice quiet. "You do not have to say anything." She did not. But the next day she invited him to supper. They sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, sharing stew and cornbread while Leela slept in the next room. The girl had started staying with Adeline most nights. No one else had stepped forward to care for her. "You are young to be carrying so much," Quinton said, watching her scoop stew into bowls. "I manage." "What happened to your family?" "I left them," she said simply. "Not because they were cruel, they were just blind. Wanted me to marry a man twice my age with land and no heart." She looked at him. "I chose this instead. The school, freedom," he nodded, understanding more than he let on. That night after he washed the dishes and she dried them, he walked to the door and paused. "I will be at the orchard tomorrow," he said, not looking back. "There will be music again, Quinton." He turned. "I still do not dance," he smiled, not pressing. "Then I will just wait, I have time." But the truth was, time had not been kind to either of them. Adeline lay awake that night, listening to the sound of Leela's breathing and wondering how someone like Quinton carried all that grief in silence and still had room to offer kindness. The next week brought rain, hard and cold. The children stayed inside, restless and loud, and Quinton showed up with hand-carved toys. He said he had made himself wooden horses, a tiny wagon, a puzzle box for Leela. Adeline watched him kneel beside the girl, showing her how the lid opened. Leela smiled for the first time in weeks. Later, when the children had gone, Adeline lit a fire and poured tea. She handed Quinton a cup and their fingers brushed. She pulled away too quickly. "I am not good at this," she said. "At what?" "Letting people in." Quinton nodded. "I am not good at letting them go." She looked up, eyes meeting his. Something passed between them, quiet and steady. That night he did not walk away after supper. He stood in her kitchen, the firelight warm against the walls, and held out his hand. "No music," he said. "Just you and me." She hesitated, heart pounding. "I do not dance," she whispered again. His hand did not waver. "Then let me teach you in my arms." Slowly, Adeline stepped forward. Her fingers slipped into his and he pulled her close, his other hand resting gently at her waist. They did not move much, just swayed in the quiet, the fire crackling low behind them. Her head came to rest on his chest before she realized she had even leaned in. His heartbeat was steady, strong. "I feel like I have been waiting to breathe for a long time," she murmured. Quinton's hand tightened slightly at her back. "Then breathe now." And in his arms, for the first time in years, she did. The frost came early that year, curling along the windows of the schoolhouse and threading silver through the branches of the cottonwoods by the river. Adeline began lighting the stove before first light, her hands red from the cold water in the wash basin. The children came wrapped in scarves and mismatched mittens, cheeks ruddy, eyes bright. They tracked snow across her floors and left their laughter behind like footprints. Quinton started bringing firewood without her asking. He cut it himself, splitting logs just past dawn and stacking them neatly under her awning. She never saw him arrive, but she always saw the work he left. One morning, as she wiped ash from her sleeves, she opened the door and found a jar of plum preserves sitting atop the stack, wrapped in a square of calico cloth. She still hadn't said yes to anything, not with words, but she brought the jar in and set it on her shelf. That Sunday, she found him at the cemetery. She hadn't intended to go there. She'd taken Leela to gather pine cones for a lesson on counting, but the girl had wandered toward the iron gate, drawn without knowing why. Adeline followed her and saw Quinton kneeling beside a small headstone, his hat in his hands, snow melting on his shoulders. She didn't speak, just waited. After a few minutes, he rose, brushing his palms on his trousers, and turned to her. "You come here often?" she asked, her voice low. "Only when I need to remember." Leela had fallen quiet, standing between them. She reached up and took his hand, and he didn't flinch. Adeline looked at the name carved into the stone. "Miriam," he nodded, "and Clara." She didn't ask which was the mother, which the daughter. It didn't matter. Grief didn't sort itself into neat compartments. "You stay out here long?" she asked. "Long enough." They walked back through the snow, him holding Leela's other hand now. Adeline watched the way their boots left 3 parallel tracks all the way back to the road. That evening, after the girl had gone to sleep, Adeline drew a chair beside the stove and handed Quinton a mug of coffee. He took it without speaking, his fingers warming against the tin. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Sometimes." "But I never do." "Why not?" "Because places like this don't let you run from yourself. They make you stand still and face what's inside." Adeline traced the rim of her mug. "I used to think if I kept moving, I'd outrun what I left behind." "You didn't?" "No." She turned her head and found him watching her, not with pity but with a kind of quiet recognition that made her chest tighten. "I was engaged once," she said. "He was kind, but he didn't see me." "Not really." Quinton didn't interrupt. "I wanted to be more than someone's wife. I wanted to teach, to matter in some way, and when I told him that, he said I was selfish." Quinton leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You were brave." She shook her head. "I was scared." Bravery's not what you show people, it's what you carry when no one's looking. The room felt closer after that, the fire casting long shadows across the floorboards. She didn't move when he reached out and placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. Later, he stood to leave and she walked him to the door. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked. He smiled, not wide, just enough that she felt it settle behind her ribs. "If you want me to." "I do." Snow fell again that night, soft and soundless. Adeline stood by the window long after he'd gone, watching the flakes gather along the fence he'd mended weeks ago. In the morning, she found a new pair of mittens on Leela's desk, stitched from wool, clumsy in the way that meant he'd made them himself. She didn't say anything, just slipped them onto the girl's hands and watched her smile. And that night, when the house was quiet and the wind tapped against the shutters, Adeline took the jar of plum preserves from the shelf and placed it on the table between two plates. She lit the lamp, set out bread, and left the door unlatched, just in case. The days shortened and the snow deepened until the whole valley seemed hushed beneath it. Each morning, Quinton arrived before the sun, his boots leaving clean impressions across the powder-white yard. He didn't knock anymore. She didn't need him to. That afternoon, a wagon creaked into Alder Bend bearing crates of supplies from Virginia City. The driver, a man with frostbitten ears and a habit of talking too loud, handed Adeline a wrapped parcel stamped with a seal from the county school board. She opened it at her desk after the children left, finding a new slate board, a stack of readers, and a letter folded in stiff creases. She read it twice before folding her hands in her lap. When the door opened behind her, she didn't turn. She knew the sound of his coat brushing the frame. "They're sending someone to inspect the school," she said. He stepped closer. "Is that trouble? They want to see if it's worth keeping open past spring. Enrollment's low. They think the children can be taught over in Sheridan." Quinton leaned against the windowsill, snow melting on his shoulders. "And what do you think?" "I think if they close it, half these children won't be taught at all." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "When will they come?" "3 weeks. A Mr. Edwin Partridge." Sounds like a man who's never been past the edge of his own map. She exhaled, not quite a laugh. "They'll want proper records, measured progress. A list of community support. You've got that, not on paper." He crossed the room, picked up a stub of chalk, and turned one of the slates toward him. "Then we'll put it on paper." She watched him write with surprising steadiness, lines forming beneath his hand, names, ages, parent trades. He paused at Leila's entry. "She has none to speak for her," he said. "She has me," he met her eyes, "and me." There was a silence after that, but it didn't stretch too far. She reached for the ledger and began filling in the rest. Later that night, after supper, when Leila had gone to sleep curled up beside the stove with a quilt tucked under her chin, Quinton stayed seated at the table. "You ever think about building something more permanent?" he asked, voice low. Adeline looked up from her mending. "Like what?" "A place of your own, not borrowed, not rented, yours." She set the needle down. "I've never had the means. I've got land just east of here, a bit of prairie and some creek-fed pasture. Been holding it, not sure for what." "Why are you telling me this?" He shifted, not fidgeting, just grounding himself. "Because I'd like to build something with you, not just a house. A life." She didn't speak for a long moment, hands still in her lap. The wind tapped lightly against the shutters. "You're not asking me to give anything up." "No," he said. "I'm asking if you'll let something grow. There'd be gossip. There already is." She gave a soft, tired breath. "I don't need saving, I know, that's why I'm here." She rose then, walked to the table, and placed her hand over his. His fingers curled around hers instinctively, warm and strong. "I've never trusted easily," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just trust me." The lamp flickered between them, softening the room. She didn't pull away. That Sunday, Quinton met with the men in town one by one. He didn't ask for favors. He asked for signatures. Names on a petition, letters of support, proof that the school mattered. They wrote them, some awkwardly, some with pride, and he carried them in a satchel made from worn canvas and leather. Adeline focused on the children. She prepared lessons with more precision, helped the older ones draft their own letters and taught them to speak clearly, to stand tall when the time came. The evening before the inspector was due, she found Quinton sitting by the riverbank beneath the cottonwoods. He'd cleared the snow from a bench made of hewn logs. The sun was dipping behind the ridge, turning the water to gold. She sat beside him, pulling her shawl tighter. "I'm scared it won't be enough," she said. "Then we'll make more." She looked at him, her voice strangely steady. "I used to think if I opened my heart again, it would just mean more to lose." He turned his head. "And now I think there's more to gain." He didn't answer. He just reached for her hand, and this time she threaded her fingers through his without hesitation. They sat in silence until the light faded, the last of it catching on the snow like the edge of a promise. The morning Mr. Partridge arrived, Alder Bend stood still under a pale sky, the light thin and sharp like early blown glass. A hush held over the town that wasn't quite fear, but something close. The kind of waiting that presses behind the ribs. Adeline had scrubbed the schoolroom until the pine boards shone. The children wore their cleanest woolens, hair combed stiff with melted snow. She dressed Leila herself, buttoning the girl's faded blue dress with hands she hoped didn't tremble. Quinton stood beside the stove, coat off, sleeves rolled. He didn't speak much that morning, but when she passed him the ledger, their fingers brushed. He didn't let go right away. The inspector came on a borrowed horse from Sheridan, his hat too stiff, his collar too high. He introduced himself with a clipped nod, then stepped inside and looked around like he was measuring the walls against some invisible standard. "You the schoolmistress?" he asked. "I am." He opened a small black book and began with questions, enrollment numbers, attendance patterns, curriculum. She answered evenly, her voice clear, but her back stayed rigid no matter how she tried to ease it. When he asked to observe a lesson, she had the older children read aloud from their history readers, then guided them through an arithmetic slate exercise. The younger ones sat quietly, folding cloth squares and tracing letters. Leila concentrated so hard her tongue stuck out from the corner of her mouth. Afterward, Mr. Partridge stepped out to take notes. Quinton followed. Adeline watched through the window as they spoke, the inspector frowning, Quinton calm. She couldn't hear their words, but Quinton's hands moved once, slow, deliberate. Not pleading. Explaining. By midday, the children had been dismissed, and the inspector remained seated at one of the desks, reading through the letters Quinton had collected. Adeline knelt by the stove, feeding the fire one stick at a time, her back to him. "You've done more with less than most I've seen," he said finally. She turned. "Is that enough?" "It might be." He stood, adjusting his coat. "Sheridan's larger, but it's not better." "I'll file a favorable report." She didn't thank him. She just nodded once. He tipped his hat and left. That evening she stood on her porch, the wind soft against her cheeks. Quinton leaned against the railing, a knife in his hand, whittling a sliver of cedar into a smooth oval. "You told him the truth?" she asked. "Yes. And if he hadn't listened? I'd have built our own room and let you teach there." She turned to face him. "You said I did." The sun was low, catching on the hills, turning the snow gold at the edges. A pair of geese passed overhead, their shadows gliding across the open field. "I've been thinking," he said. "That land I told you about, it's close enough to town, enough to build a small house, a garden, maybe space for a new schoolroom if it ever comes to that." She didn't answer right away. Her hands were clasped in front of her, the hem of her shawl fluttering. Then she looked at him, and her voice came quiet but steady. "Would it have a room for Leila?" His knife paused mid-stroke. "Of course it would." She stepped closer. "And for me," he didn't move. "You'd be the first wall I laid." Her eyes searched his, and for the first time there was no distance in them. "I want that," she said. "But not because I've run out of choices, because I've found one worth staying for." His hand dropped the carving. He reached for her, slow, like approaching a startled bird. When she didn't pull away, he slipped his arms around her waist. She rested her palms on his chest. "I still don't know how to dance," she whispered. "Then let me teach you in my arms," and he did. Right there on the porch, with the wind curling around them and the horizon soft with light. They moved in a circle no wider than a wagon wheel, her head against his shoulder, his hand steady at the small of her back. There was no music, only the hush of winter settling in and the shared rhythm between two people who had stopped running. Inside, Leela stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. The fire crackled low and the smell of cedar lingered in the room. The days ahead would be long, some hard, some kind, but they would not be faced alone. And for the first time in either of their lives, that was enough. They married before the thaw. It was a quiet ceremony held behind the schoolhouse under a sky the color of worn linen. Reverend Alcott read from his pocket Bible with his voice rasped by age, and the townsfolk stood bundled in wool and flannel, forming a loose circle in the snow. Leela held Adeline's hand the entire time, her cheeks pink from the cold, her gaze steady. Adeline wore her mother's brooch pinned to the collar of her dress. Not for sentiment, but because it was the one thing from her old life that had not asked her to change. The lace at her cuffs had been stitched by Mrs. Deller from the mercantile. The rings were simple. Quinton had carved hers from a strip of gold he'd carried in his pack for years. It bore no stone, only the faint impression of a wildflower he'd pressed into the band with the tip of his blade. When the vows were said, she didn't tremble. Quinton's hands were warm, steady, and she met him without hesitation. The kiss they shared was not long, but it was certain. It was the kind of kiss that came after loss, after slow trust, after the building of something solid beneath your feet. Afterward, there was bread and dried apple pie in the schoolhouse, and mugs of coffee thick with molasses. The children from the class had drawn pictures as gifts: houses with smoke curling from the chimneys, stick figure horses, a garden with improbable vegetables. Leela's drawing was of 3 people standing beneath a tree. No names, no words, just 3 figures with joined hands. By late afternoon, the townsfolk had gone, and the schoolhouse was quiet again. Adeline and Quinton walked the long way around the orchard before heading home, their boots crunching softly. She didn't speak until they reached the fence he'd mended the first week they met. "I used to think marriage meant giving something up," she said. His hand found hers. "What do you think now?" "I think I've gained something I didn't know I needed." That evening, they unpacked the last of Quinton's things into the house they'd built on the east pasture. The walls still smelled of sawdust and linseed. The floors were uneven in places, but solid. There was a small room for Leela, painted pale blue, with quilts folded at the foot of the bed and a shelf for her books. She had placed her wooden puzzle box on the windowsill herself. Quinton hung his coat on the peg by the door and set his rifle in the corner, where it would stay unless needed. Adeline pulled the curtains closed and lit the oil lamp. The glow caught the curve of her cheek, the softness of her hair where it had come loose from its braid. When she turned, he was watching her the way he always had, quiet, steady, like she was something he'd waited for before he even knew her name. "I don't think I quite believe it yet," she said. "You will," he answered. "We've got time." He reached for her and she came to him without pause. No more waiting, no more holding back. That night they lay beneath the quilt she'd pieced through the winter, the one with squares from her old dresses and bits of linen from his shirt sleeves. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting a flickering amber light across the floorboards. Her head rested against his shoulder and his arm stayed firm around her waist. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet in the room was full, not empty. In the weeks that followed, the snow melted in sheets down the hills. The creek by the pasture ran faster, and wild geese returned to skim the water. Quinton planted seed potatoes in the garden behind the house, and Adeline taught Leela to read from a new primer sent by the county board. The school remained open. Enrollment rose. 2 new families moved into the valley, drawn by the land and the promise of a school that hadn't folded. Adeline added a second bench to the classroom. Quinton built it himself, sanded smooth, initials carved beneath where no one could see. On Saturdays, they walked the edge of the property with Leela between them, her hand in each of theirs. stopping to listen for meadowlarks or to watch deer tracks vanish into the brush. One evening in early spring, Adeline stood by the window, her hand resting over her belly, quiet and thoughtful. Behind her, Quinton was sharpening a chisel at the table, the sound soft and rhythmic. She turned. "I think we'll need to add another room." He looked up, the whetstone pausing in his hand. "You're sure?" She nodded, eyes bright with something new, not fear, not surprise. Just the deep, settled joy of someone who had waited long enough for good things to last. He crossed the room, rested his palm over hers, and said nothing. He didn't need to. That summer, the house filled with the scent of cut grass and bread left to rise on the windowsill. Leela spent her afternoons drawing on scraps of paper, waiting for her new sibling to arrive. Quinton built a cradle from pine and lined it with wool. Adeline sewed small shirts in the evenings, her fingers sure, her heart steady. They lived simply but not small. Their days were full of work and warmth, and the kind of love that didn't need naming every morning because it was stitched into the fabric of their living. And when the baby came a girl with a strong cry and dark curls, Adeline held her close and whispered the name they'd chosen together, Miriam. Not to replace what had been lost, but to honor it, to carry it forward gently. That night, with Leela asleep in her bed and the baby nestled between them, Adeline leaned into Quinton and whispered, "I never thought it could be like this." He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "You made it so?" She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely at home. The wind moved softly through the eaves, and the stars blinked steady above the prairie. Inside the house, the fire burned low, but the warmth lingered, held close between the walls they'd built, the lives they'd chosen, and the love they'd come to without hurry, without fear, and without end.